Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay. There was some internet connection issues. Hi, I'm myself Jagmit Singh. I'm going to talk about the challenges and limitations in Android automation and how we can overcome using Espresso. So myself, I'm Jagmit Singh, working at CBC Digital Labs, responsible for the native app automation for their Listen product, basically for their I was working on the radio and music app, and now we are launching a new Listen app, so I'm working on automation of that. So what is CBC? CBC is a national broadcaster. In Canada, is branded at CBC/Radio Canada. It's responsible for primary radio and TV and radio, and we are now doing more and more digital stuff, so that's what I'm working on. So today my agenda of talk is that I'm going to briefly talk about what is Espresso, what are the common challenges in Android UI automation, and how we can overcome these challenges using Espresso, and then also talk about writing Espresso test, and then the integration I did using other UI framework and libraries like TestButler and UI Automator. I'm going to talk about that and demo that also. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the continuous integration using Espresso, Jenkins, and Firebase, the other cloud platform I used. So what is Espresso? Espresso is a native platform to test Android, and it helps in writing reliable UI test. So it's developed internally by Google, and it is open sourced in 2013. And it supports very low down version of Android, starting from API level 2.2 and go to the very latest, like API level 28, which is Android 9. And it's an instrumentation-based API, and it uses Android JUnit runner to run those tests. So that's briefly about what is Espresso. And some of the challenges which we face in Android UI automation, and that's very common challenges in UI automation world, but I'm specifically target about Android. So tests are flaky. That's a very common problem, and we face it all the time. And tests are slow. It takes long to run the UI tests, which is sort of challenging because it adds to your testing time. And it's just a sort of effort time becomes a bottleneck. And scaling, testing out how to scale the automation. So other UI framework had the challenges that they're limited, the testing activity is limited within the app. So to do activity outside the apps becomes a limitation. So, and then there was another challenge I faced, other UI framework like Appium is difficulty in locating the UI elements. If the identifier is there, that's fine, but if there's no specific identifiers there, then you end up using long XPaths. So that's caused a lot of maintenance headache, and they're fragile too. So yeah, these are some of the challenges I faced when I was using other UI framework before, and yeah, from experience, that's some of the key challenges I faced. And so since I experimented using Espresso, and I find some of the challenges I was able to overcome from my past using other UI framework. So what I find is like their tests are very fast. Espresso test runs in seconds. So there's a huge timing advantage I got, and they're reliable. In a sense, they are quite less flaky. They are like, you cannot say they are 100% reliable, but you have flakiness factor, but reduced by huge margins. So, and the biggest other advantage I find that you can test outside an app. That's one of the key features I find in Espresso, in that the tests, the other UI framework which you can work in tandem, like I'm going to talk more about like UI Automator and Test Butler, but the other frameworks which you can work in tandem with Espresso, and you can test outside an app. So that was one of the key advantages I find when I migrated to Espresso. And also these tests are developed inside the Android app project. So the advantage is that even the developers can collaborate with the automation engineer like myself to write Espresso Test. So there's advantage that there's more closer collaboration between developers and automation engineers like myself. And being Espresso tests are within the app, so they have access to various layers in the app. So you can mock certain layers of the app, and you can do more even like low-down tests. So like it becomes like you can do both white box testing you can do, and also you can write a lot of black box testing. So it have different areas you can cover using Espresso Test. And lastly, they are developed by, it's a native platform developed by Google, so they are always ahead of the curve in an instance that when Google launches a new feature, so support is right away, and launches a new device or API version, so the support is right away. So that's one of the, that's also one of the key advantages of using Espresso. I want to highlight, it's like sounds maybe complicated because it's a native platform. People think it may be very tricky to write this Espresso test. I'm going to talk about in few slides. So it sounds tricky, but once you know how to do it, it becomes easier. So just like any other project. In the Android app project, you have something called build.gradle. So you specify all the dependencies in that build.gradle. To support your Android Espresso test, you add a dependency for Espresso. And if you're using other UI framework, like here I'm using UI Automator and Test Butler, so you specify the dependency there. And here also, like in the top, you specify the JUnit runner, so which basically helps you in executing the test. So that's extra dependencies and extra requirement you specify in the build.gradle file. And here in the Espresso test, we use JUnit annotations to basically JUnit annotations to use. They are like @rule annotations. So first annotation is to launch an application. So it's called activity test rule. And but there are so many rules you can define. So in my Espresso test, I have another rule called retry analyzer. So basically, a test case fails first time, it re-executes that many times as you specify. So in a way that if you have some flakiness behavior in your test, you can use this retry rule to relaunch the test, and it will keep on executing until it passes or fail. So you have more confidence that it has executed so many times and then it failed or passed. So you can see that in the reports. But you have other rules you can define. I'm going to show you in the further. So this is my, for example, sample Espresso test. So I already talked about the rules. The first rule is to launch an activity, and second to the retry analyzer rule. And as you use like an add before annotation by JUnit. Here I'm trying to navigate my application to certain portion so that the next test runs after that. So here, like I said, like we have like a retry rule, so execute that many times. Like executing 2 times, you can specify 3 to 4 times, whatever you want. And in the next, I'm verifying that the play icon is there. So that's a very simple test. So yeah, so I'm going to show a demo. So sorry. Because of internet connection, I have to go separately show the demo. So here I'm going to show you how the Espresso test sits within the Android Studio. So here the first folder is basically all the Android code sits, and in second is all the Espresso test code sits, and the last one is all the UI tests. So all they sit together in the one project. And we have the resource folder, which basically there are various XML files which the Android app uses. So same UI elements I'm also using, and they're also using the same thing. So here's like the main activity XML file, so which is basically provided by developers. I'm going to use the UI elements in that XML file for my Espresso test. So in a way that you don't have to, the collaboration is right away, so you don't have to wait for that, and you can just use the same one. So it's like a much easier, faster development at sake. And then if they have various assets, I'm going to show in the drawable thing, there are various assets which even the developers use. They're like image files. So in the Espresso test, you can refer to the same image files to do some verification. For example, the play icon is the same thing, or the pause icon is the same thing. So you can use these images to verify certain icons in the code itself. Yeah, so I'm just going to show you the next slide. So here, next is that the build.gradle, which I already talked about, but I'm going to talk again. So it's the same, it specify other dependencies or the Espresso dependency, which you specify it here. And it have other dependency which your app developer uses. So like JUnit or any other dependencies, like Roboelectric is there. So you can specify whatever dependency your Espresso test require, you can specify it here. And in Espresso, it supports, right, you can use either Java or Kotlin to write the test. One of the first few, I started experimented to write tests in Java, and then I recently experimenting with Kotlin also. So my first test I started writing in Java. So here, this class is extending a rule class. So where I specify all different rules. So you can specify like rules where you want to clear the cache before the app starts, before your test starts. So you want to have your test starts very clean. So you can specify this rule, or you can want to clear the preferences in the app. You can specify that rule also, or you want to your Espresso test to access the location. So you can specify that rule. So you can define so many custom rules. Like there are so many rules you can define, and there's a conditional ignore rule. So that's the other rule I use, is that if you want the test to run against certain devices or emulators, you can define this rule, and it runs only against a particular simulator at runtime. So yeah, so I'm just waiting for the video to go to the next. Yeah, so here in my test, I want to execute only against a real device, so I specify that it should not run against emulator. So that's a conditional ignore rule I'm using. So yeah, and here in this test, I'm basically calling an API and getting a display title from there, and then I'm verifying that in the UI element, same display title shows up. So in this particular API call I'm using the dev code to basically use the same code base to do an API call. So then in a sense that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, so you can use the same code base to some extent to write in your test. Yeah, so this is the API call I'm making, and then I go to that UI element, and I want to see that same display title shows up. Yeah. Yeah, in the end, it's basically verifying that same display title shows up. Yeah, so next code, I just want to show you how the Kotlin codes could like. So it have, this is my another Kotlin code. So the advantage of having support of Kotlin in Java, that even your Kotlin test code can access the Java library, shared libraries. So you don't have to reformat and change your Java to Kotlin, so they have very close interoperability. Yeah. So let me pause this video and go to the slides. So I did an integration with Espresso and Test Butler. So Test Butler is a library basically originally developed by LinkedIn. So they developed this library to write more reliable UI tests. So that was with that objective they developed this library, and so I'm going to show you So I'm going to briefly talk about how the Test Butler works. So it's an APK file you have to install in an emulator before, and it talks to a Test Butler library, which is inside the code, inside the Espresso code. So with this library, with this app, the Test Butler app has total control on your simulator. So it has access to all the permissions, and basically this APK basically controls your phone. So with this Test Butler on the phone, you have more controlled environment. And because the control environment, you have more reliable test. So if you're running a long test, and it can prevent your application not to crash. So because it has total control, it can prevent not to crash and doesn't allow any unnecessarily or obstructing dialog message to shows up. And it has other features. It can switch on the Wi-Fi on and off. It can switch off your data on and off. It can change the locale if you want to make it English to French or another language. It can change that. It can change your orientation with this library, and it can disable the animations. So in a nutshell, it can make your test more reliable and with additional features like this. So in my experimented, I want to run a network test. Basically, I want to make a switch toggle between switch Wi-Fi on and off, and I want that my application to run more seamlessly. So that's what I experimented using Test Butler and Espresso. I'm going to show you a video on this. Yeah, so this is my Espresso code, and I'm using the Test Butler library inside the code. So you first have to set up a Test Butler. And here I'm being sort of set up a Test Butler file. And the Test Butler requires that your emulator should not have a Google API. So that's a precondition, like a runtime requirement. So I'm assuming that that requirement is met. If requirement is not met, it won't run the test, this particular Wi-Fi test. So initially, I switch on the Wi-Fi and data to start the test. That's by doing a setup file. Just waiting for. Yeah, so I'm switching on the Wi-Fi to start a test to start from the fresh. And in this test, I'm basically I'm going to show you next. So I switch off. I start the music stream, and then I switch off the Wi-Fi. And then in a few seconds, I switch on the Wi-Fi again. So I want to see that when I switch on the Wi-Fi again, the music stream reconnect automatically and starts playing. This is the one scenario I want to test, but you can have multiple scenarios like for this. For example, you can switch off the Wi-Fi for a longer time, and the music stream does not start. So this is the other scenario I have covered in another test case, but this is one scenario I'm covering that when Wi-Fi reconnects, the music stream starts playing again automatically. So here I'm going to start this Espresso, this particular Wi-Fi test is going to run against a simulator, and so here the Wi-Fi is on, and then it'll switch off the Wi-Fi. Yeah, so when you switch off Wi-Fi, you get an error message. You can potentially check this error message also shows up, and then the Wi-Fi comes back in about few seconds, and the music stream start playing again. So this is the behavior I'm trying to test in my app. So other UI framework I used with Espresso was called UI Automator. So Espresso is sort of limited to test activity within the application, but you can use UI Automator in tandem to test activities outside the app. So you can access the notification bar on application, or you can test other applications. You can test camera, you can test contacts and dialer like that. So in my experiment, I tested using for the notification bar. So I'm going to show you about how I did it. So here, first you initialize a device. So that's like M device is you initialize it. That's like coming from a UI Automator, and so then you set in a setup file you initialize and get an instance of of this device, and then you play a music stream. So when you play a music stream, a notification bar comes up on your application, and I want to test that notification bar comes up. And I want to see that I have a total control on this notification bar. I can pause and play, or I can check that icon shows up or the text shows up. So with the UI Automator in the test, you can verify all these things that which you want to require to test on a notification bar. So here in this test, it's basically clicking on a pause and play on the notification bar. So I'm going to launch this test, and so you're going to start the music stream, and then a notification bar comes up after music start playing, and so here you can pause and play from the notification bar using this UI Automator feature, and then you can potentially verify that other text shows up on the notification bar. So yeah, this is one with test you can test outside an application basically. So. And also I also did like using Espresso and using Espresso and Jenkins. I did like a continuous integration at my place. So that's like a similar like model like we used whenever there's a new dev commit. So Jenkins senses that the new dev commit is there, and it starts an Espresso test. And in my case, I'm using a Firebase, which have different collections of virtual and real devices. So you can choose what device you want to run against, and it will run that on a Firebase. And selected builds are basically pushed to Fabric. And when it pushed to Fabric, all the concerned people in the Fabric group will get a message that new build is there, and then they can download this build from the Fabric to test it. So yeah, I think I went very fast. Yeah. Any questions? I think so. I have enough time today. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for great presentation. My name is Igor from Tinder. What are you guys using for test sharding and prioritization? Are you using fork, spoon? Any utensils?
Sorry, can you say your question again? I don't get it.
Yes, for test sharding and parallelization, to run tests in parallel for Espresso, do you use fork or spoon or any other framework to speed up test execution in CI?
No, exactly. I'm not using any parallelization right now. So no, we're not using that parallel concept, yeah, but something we have to maybe consider using.
And
right now we have sorry.
And the second question, for network mocking and stubbing, do you guys use anything like HTTP mock web server or anything else?
We are not in Espresso Test, we are not using mocking, but like people who are writing unit tests, they are using motivators, for example, and we can mock the APIs and all this, make API response or the request. So, but in Espresso, I'm not using it, but there's a potential you can use it. Any questions for that?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Ziebold with Worldwide Technology, and I was going to ask, closer, sorry. In the beginning, you used the example of Apply Test having a hard time finding elements on the page.
Yeah.
How do you feel Espresso is better at that?
My challenge before was that if they're like in a recycler view, we have a recycler view, and it's like in that situation, it sort of becomes difficult. You can locate an element using XPath, right? But this becomes sort of, if you don't have a definite way, it's become very long XPaths, and that's sort of become fragile for me when I was using Appium. Here, for example, in Espresso, you can identify an recycler view, and then, for example, you can point out using position, for example, or you can have hash descendant feature. So it becomes more seamless, I would say. Yeah. So, and it has, because it's become more seamless to do. I can show you after how I'm doing it in a detailed manner, how I'm doing, because, for example, recycler view was very complicated to do that testing in the Appium world, but when I migrated to Espresso, I can show you more details how I'm doing it, but it was more simpler for me. And it's more, the tests are more reliable, that's sake. Yeah, because these recycler view tests are more like very flaky if you're doing in other world, but in this it's very reliable. Yeah.
Hello. So plan to start testing on mobile devices, and I'd like to use both iOS and Android. So what recommendation, which tools to use? I heard that Appium might be a good choice, but why these tools are better?
So my recommendation, I prefer more native tools, right? So, and this Espresso is native. I told you some of the key advantages, and then before my presentation, there was a talk about native for the iOS, which is Xcode UI test. So being native, they have so many advantages, right? So we talked about advantages. When I was using Appium before, one key advantage I find was the shared code base. So you can have one code base which can be potentially shared between iOS and Android. But they have so many limitations with Appium, especially about Android. I haven't experimented Xcode UI to that sake, but with Espresso, I find quite a few advantages to it. With Appium, there are a lot of restrictions. Like testing the app, outside the app was pretty tough for me. Like I had used it almost 2 years back. But I'm not sure if there are any new features adding up, so you can make that part easier, but I'm not sure.
You know, my purpose is just look at a browser. So browser testing, so from that point of view, do you have many limitations?
You're talking about mobile browsers, right? Mm-hmm. Mobile, this Espresso is purely for native apps. So for the browser testing, you can potentially use like Selenium or Appium and all that tools.
On mobile devices?
For the browser testing. You're talking mobile browser, right?
From mobile devices.
Yeah, but I'm saying that for native app, this is a tool, but if you're talking about mobile browser testing, that's a separate area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but that's a separate area, actually.
My name is Wayne. Do you have any challenge like identifying web view and native apps, like hybrid application and the native application, those things in Espresso?
I haven't experimented with hybrid. I just purely experiment with native apps. Yeah.
Okay, so if there's a hybrid application, do you recommend using Espresso to do the automations?
My guess is that is possible. That's my guess. Yeah. Sorry, I should say it again. No, because Espresso is purely for native, because the requirement of having Espresso Test is sits where your app Android project is, right? For example, if you're having a React application, so if you have a React application, React app.
There's web view, so it was calling those web browsers.
Okay.
Yeah, those kind of things. So can it be identical?
I don't think so it's going to work for those type of things, because Espresso has a requirement that it sits in the same Android project, right? So if you're having if you have like a hybrid app, so you don't have that code access, basically, or we can have an element that Espresso Test it in that place. So I don't think so you can do that.
Hi, George from Wowza Streaming. You mentioned earlier, and I saw it in your code, that you were using Mockito. Do you also integrate with Power Mockito in the Spring frameworks?
This is the Mockito library. What I'm showing you is basically right now used by developers. So I have some idea, but I haven't used in Espresso Test. Yeah, but there's a potential that you can use RoboElectric and Espresso. So if you're using that integration, you don't have to execute this just you don't have to launch an application. You can run this in the background, something like that. And then that's also one way of doing it, but I haven't experimented. But I've heard about it. So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Livio. I have a question. Is it possible to use Espresso to test the app in another project? I mean, using the precompiled build or pre-built APK and write the tests in another project?
You mean if you have a test and you okay.
I mean, writing the test outside the source code of the app.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think that's it. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.